Good afternoon. This is Courtney Neubauer with the Division of Nutrition Support, and today we're going to start the presentation on the community eligibility provision. My plan is to go over a little bit of some background information, but also lead into the waiver of the community eligibility provision deadlines for this school year, how to go about calculating ISP and claiming percentages, other CEP considerations to think of, submitting the population data form, submitting the CEP worksheet, also some information regarding our EScholar updates that are coming, and then answer any questions. So most of you have probably been utilizing CEP for a few years now. Some of you may have been fairly new to CEP, and some of you may be looking at electing CEP for school year 21-22, maybe because your identified student percentage is finally high enough, whether it be from the result of this pandemic or from the hurricanes that we saw earlier in the school year. But CEP was established by the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act, and it operates on a 4-year cycle, and it allows students to receive free meals under the school breakfast and the school lunch program, and you're not to collect meal applications on CEP. The criteria to participate, so prior to approval for CEP, school food authorities must agree to serve all children free breakfasts and lunches for 4 successive years, to pay any costs using non-federal funds that may be associated, pay any costs associated with breakfast and lunch that may be in excess of the federal reimbursement, and you would pay those funds with non-federal funding sources. You cannot collect applications. Also, you should count the total breakfast and lunches served to students. You cannot be a residential childcare institution, and SFAs, either by individual site or clusters of sites, must have an enrollment with at least 40% of the students considered identified students. So that's just a little background of community eligibility provision. Like I said, it's been around for a little while now, and some of you have been probably participating since some of the early days. But this year we do have a waiver of the community eligibility provision deadlines, and that is the Child Nutrition Response number 82. And this waiver extends the deadlines related to CEP reporting and election during COVID-19. And as many of you know, the deadline for submitting the CEP data is typically April. So we're now in June, which we usually are looking at that final election of CEP, which is usually done by June 30th. And now we're just starting to talk about CEP data being submitted. So we know that these deadlines have been drastically changed due to the COVID-19 in this particular school year. So the community eligibility provision deadlines for this school year, the first deadline that has been extended is the deadline, the annual deadline for the data used to calculate ISP. So typically we use that single point in time of April 1st as the day in which we pull the enrollment and the identified students. So there's usually that one point that we use for determination of ISP. And for this school year, SFAs are able to use any point in time between the start of the school year, which was July 1st, 2020, and the end of the school year, which is June 30th, 2021. So you can select any date in that entire year when the data best suits you. So I had a school system that I spoke to earlier today who had a date in October where the enrollment and the identified students was the best scenario for her. And so because of this flexibility in date, you are able to choose any date that you would like to use in the school year to pull that data. Just know that when you are pulling the data for CEP, both the enrollment and the identified students must be from that point in time. So you have to pull both of those from that point of time, but you can choose any date between the start of the school year and the end of the school year. The notification, so usually by April 15th, you're submitting that CEP worksheet with the population data and your initial CEP elections. And that is usually done by April 15th. And this year it has been extended to June 30th. Also, every year we are responsible at the state agency of publicizing the CEP data, and we typically post that on our website by May 1st, and we usually send that same information to USDA by the May 1st deadline. And this year, the deadline is June 30th. And typically, the final election for CEP must be done by June 30th. And this year, the final election must be made by September 30th, 2021. So, it kind of sometimes doesn't make any sense as to why that deadline is after school starts. But my thought is that there was probably some insight as to what would be coming with the ability to operate seamless summer. And so these deadlines were put into place knowing that most school systems would be operating seamless summer in next school year. So this waiver, what it means is by June 30th, 2021, SFAs must submit the population data form and the initial CEP worksheet through the Child Nutrition Program website. And the identified student percentage may be calculated using data drawn anytime between July 1st, 2020 and June 30th, 2021. By September 30th, 2021, SFAs must make the final election regarding CEP participation for school year 21-22. If you need to, at that point in time, you can also resubmit the population data form, and that information would still need to include data that is drawn from any time between July 1st and June 30th, but it is possible for you to resubmit that population data anytime before September 30th. And we have two memos that are posted. The first one is SFS 21-X118, which is actually the waiver from USDA related to the extension of these deadlines. And the second, which is SFS 21-X124, is the information about the deadline as well. So the identified students, these are the students that you have identified as eligible for free meals as a result of some other means other than an application. And so these are typically our direct certification students and their siblings that are identified through SNAP and also through TANF. Additionally, students that are identified as participating in FITAP, and then if we have students that we've identified as homeless, runaway, migrant, foster, or Head Start, or Even Start by means other than an application. So if you do have documentation supporting that you have placement papers of a child that's in foster care that you could use to support that the child is truly a foster child. If you have the McKinney-Vento paperwork supporting that a child or a family is homeless that you've received from your homeless liaison, these are the type of documentation that you would be able to use to support that these children are identified students for the purposes of CEP. So the percentage of identified students, to determine what that would be, you're first going to determine the number of identified students and also the student enrollment at each prospective site. And for this year, that is data from any point in the entire school year. And you are then going to divide the number of identified students by the total enrollment at each site, and you are to keep that to 4 decimal places. From there, you multiply that value by 100, and then you keep that to 2 decimal places. And the decimal places are very important. So oftentimes we find that when the decimal places are not maintained as instructed here, that the claiming percentage that districts are using for CEP are often incorrect. So to calculate your identified students, you first would have usually some kind of printout or something from your software that shows the different classifications of students that you've identified. And do know that even though you may have that one piece of paper that has all of these numbers, you need to also maintain all of the backup that supports each and every one of these children if you're going to use this data to support election of CEP. So the first line is your DC students that were matched using the SNAP matches through eScholar. The second is your siblings. So you've matched siblings of your identified students. Your third group may be your homeless, migrant, or runaway. You'll have your foster children. And then you also may have these additional categories at the bottom. So students that submitted an application where they identified themselves as SNAP, FDPIR, or FITAP, but they're not actually DC. You may have students who were free by an income application, students that were reduced by an income application, and your paid students. So this entire group would be your entire potentially your student population, but this is not your total list of identified students. So when we look here, what we see is that we need to make sure that we're only including the children that are truly considered identified. So that first number, so the children that are DC, which is the 385, would be included. Your 118 for your siblings would also be included. You'd also include the 12 children that were deemed homeless, migrant, or runaway. And you would also include the 4 that were deemed foster. So your total would be 519 identified students. So you would not count the children that listed that they were SNAP, FDPIR, or FITAP on an application. You would not include your children that were identified free on an application. You would not identify the kids that were identified as reduced on an application, and you would not include their paid students. So from there, you would have 519 identified students out of your enrollment of 754, which here would give you 68.83% of your kids as being identified students. You want to make sure that you are including all of the possible students that you can as identified students. So you want to make sure that you're targeting students who are DC, so those that are appearing on your DC reports, and also making sure that you're extending those benefits to those siblings that are living in the household with those students. And you want to use all of your available reports. So you want to use all of the runs that you could for this school year, and that to include in that June 30th run. You can also cluster sites together to increase your ISP. So school food authorities can combine or cluster sites together to raise that percentage. So if you have one site that is low, so in this example, we have an identified student percentage of 38.24, which is below the 40%. And then we have another site that is much higher with an identified student percentage of 68.33. It is possible to combine or cluster those sites together to get an overall claiming percentage, identified student percentage that is somewhere in the middle of those two. And so when you are clustering sites, you are to add up the identified students, so the actual number of identified students, and then also the enrollment to get the total, and then do the math of dividing the identified students by the enrollment. Oftentimes we see that systems will add up the percentages and then divide those by the number of sites, and that would give you an incorrect number. So do make sure that you're adding up the actual number of students at each of those sites before you divide by the enrollment and multiply by 100. So in this example, our average identified students would be 50.69 for our total identified students. So the CEP multiplier is something that can be adjusted by USDA. It can range anywhere from 1.3 to 1.6. And currently the multiplier is 1.6. And we have not seen this multiplier change since the inception of CEP. And the 1.6 multiplier is what is included in the federal regulations, and any changes would have to be communicated well in advance through a proposed rule in the Federal Register. Once a cycle begins, SFAs lock in that multiplier for 4 years for those sites that are participating in CEP, as long as that cluster does not change the student population. So as long as the population of that cluster stays the same, then you're able to lock in that information. If something changes, so maybe you end up closing a couple of schools and kids are shifting to other schools that may or may not have been CEP, then that could potentially change the population. And we'd have to look at that individually to determine if that was a change that needed to, that caused a recertification of that CEP cluster. So after we determine our identified student percentage, we then would want to determine how we're going to claim these meals. So what is the percentage that we're going to use for actually claiming our free and paid meals using CEP? So to establish our claiming percentage, we're first going to determine the percentage of identified students. You're going to keep that to 2 decimal places. From there, you would multiply the percent of identified students by the established multiplier, which is currently the 1.6, and that would give you the free claiming percentage. You would keep that to 2 decimal places. From there, you would subtract the value obtained in step 1, so your free claiming percentage, from 100, and that would give you the percent that you would claim at the paid percentage. So claiming percentages are always calculated to 2 decimal places. The free and paid claiming percentage are used to calculate claims for reimbursement. It is very important that both in your software system, if you're using a software system, as well as in the claim itself, that you're applying the appropriate claiming percentage. A difference by not rounding to 2 decimal places could mean that the number of meals claimed at the free or paid rate would be different from what it should be based on that percentage. So in year 1, the claiming is based on the percent of identified students that were established in the year prior to participation. And then from there, in years 2 through 4, you can either use the percentage that you obtained in year 1, or if it is the same or better in subsequent years, you can reestablish and start those 4 years over. So the percent of identified students and student participation both influence the reimbursement received. So even if you have a really high identified student percentage, if you don't have many kids eating, then you're not going to receive as much reimbursement as you possibly could have. And maximum reimbursement is essential when you're no longer collecting income from students for meals. So we often see that a system may think that CEP is a financially viable option because the reimbursement often appears to be higher than what they're receiving in prior years, but they have to also remember that you're no longer going to be receiving the paid reimbursement from those households who are paying. So once you look at that figure, sometimes the total is not quite as financially feasible as thought. It's important to have trained staff who can find the maximum number of identified students by site and can also encourage meal participation. So I always strongly recommend scrubbing through that data multiple times to make sure that you haven't missed any students. In small systems, sometimes it's just, 5 or 10 students that can make the difference between 100% free claiming and not being 100% free claiming. I also have to remember that sometimes with increased participation, there's also some possible side effects that come along with that. So you want to make sure that you're considering space and capacity issues at serving times, also if there's food storage issues, and possibly increased staffing needs. So even school systems who do participate in CEP are still required to conduct a data match at least once annually. So usually we run those matches monthly. So we have those eScholar direct match files that are available monthly. And by federal regulation, you are required to do that at least 3 times a year if you're a traditional SFA. And if you're a CEP system, you are required to do that, run that match at least once annually. And this takes advantage of you can take advantage of any increased ISP. And also you can start looking at trends if the numbers are starting to decrease. So you can start thinking of a long-term plan if the numbers start to look like they're decreasing. And so we do require that even CEP systems submit that current population data every year by the deadline. So that's the deadline that is normally April 15th, that this year is June 30th. So the question comes, when do you establish a new base year? So anytime there's a change in student population that impacts the identified students or the enrollment, the school or group of schools must recalculate that identified student percentage. And this is explained in an older CEP memo, but it's SP 54-2016 that explains that requirement. It's also possible for new schools to elect CEP, but it is only possible for those schools to participate if the number of identified students and the total enrollment are available before counting and claiming of meals begins. And also if the new school meets the eligibility requirements. And if they do, then they can participate in CEP. And in most years, this is very difficult because that data would have to be available and the school would have to have made the election before the June 30th deadline. This year, with that deadline being extended to September 30th, it may be easier for schools to elect CEP if they are a new school or new school system. Opting out of CEP. So this is not something we see very often. Most school systems, once they opt into CEP, do stay in CEP for the full 4 years, but we do occasionally have situations that a school would opt out. And the school or SFA has the ability to opt out of CEP at any time. And the only requirements are that they notify us at LDOE of that decision, and also that they notify households of that decision and allow ample time for submission of free and reduced applications. SFAs must offer all students reimbursable free meals for a period of at least 30 operating days following the date of restoration of the standard procedures, or until you have a new determination for that child. We also have had a lot of questions about grace year. So what exactly is a CEP grace year? So normally CEP operates on a 4-year cycle. And so at the end of that 4 years, if the school system has a percentage, an ISP of over 40%, then they can reelect CEP for another 4 years. If there's an identified student percentage that may be less than 40%, but at least 30%, and for this year, that's any time between July 1st and June 30th, the school system can elect to participate in CEP for 1 grace year. And this gives an opportunity to restore eligibility without immediately resuming your standard counting and claiming, and can also avoid disruptions of universal meals. And typically the reimbursement for schools in a grace year is based off of the identified student percentage of the data that is achieved in that year 4. So this year would be between July 1st and June 30th. But a grace year is not really just a continuation of those 4 years. It's simply an extra year to be CEP when you really don't qualify for CEP. So this year, when we talk about opting out of CEP on the previous slide and the clarification of the grace year, we have a lot of schools that probably fit into one of these 2 criteria. And the reason why is because this school year 2021 that we are finishing up, is a lot of schools' 4th year of CEP. And that initial CEP election was done right after the flood of 2016. And so the data that was available in that year was very different than the data that we see now. So even though we have been in the middle of this pandemic, and you would have thought that we would have seen a huge increase of SNAP eligible families, it is not comparable to what we saw in many of the areas after the flood of 2016. So many school systems are sitting at that point where they've got to make a decision about next school year. And typically, I would not encourage a school system to operate a grace year because financially, it doesn't always make a lot of sense. So if your percentage is 34% identified students, then it would be very difficult to make that be a financially viable decision if you had to claim that such a high percentage at the paid rate. But if you are a school system that is choosing to operate the seamless summer option in next school year, all the meals would be claimed at the free rate. So it may be beneficial for you to elect to use either a grace year or even to elect CEP next year with a very low percentage of 45%, and then make a decision for school year 22-23 at the end of school year 21-22 for 22-23 to make a decision to possibly opt out, or you would then be at the end of that grace year where you'd have to return to free and reduced applications. So it's just something to really think about if you're one of those school systems that has to make a decision and your options are a grace year or not participating for a year, or electing to participate at a very low percentage. Because this year, as we move into this next school year and we're operating under seamless summer, it may be beneficial for you for all of these other other ancillary services that use that data for CEP. So whether it be the emergency broadband benefit, whether it be the potential for PEBT benefits, whether it be for discounts on ACT registration. So there's many other areas that use this data. So if it's an option to continue, that may be something that you would like to discuss, and I'd be happy to discuss that with you. We are waiting on additional guidance from USDA about CEP and hope to have that in the near future. I would have liked to have that before today, but it never has worked that way for me thus far. So I don't know why I thought it would work this time. But if you are a school and you want to elect CEP for school year 21-22, that would still be considered year one of your 4-year cycle. So school year 22-23, which would be year 2 of the cycle, may potentially be the first year that you use this percentage. There are 2 memos that are available that you can refer to on procedures that are used to ensure identified student percentage accuracy. So memo SFS 16-84. So as part of the CEP election process, state agencies are responsible for ensuring that LEAs seek to adopt CEP meet all participation requirements. So part of our system is to ensure that you're participating in breakfast and lunch, and that you have a percentage that allows you to participate in CEP. And then additionally, memo SFS 16-85, this makes the state agency responsible for reviewing a 10% or statistically valid sample of the CEP data to ensure accuracy. So this next slide's not really important for this year since everybody pretty much operated under summer feeding last year and potentially seamless summer this next year. But if you are CEP and you are system-wide CEP, then you do not need to complete the paid lunch equity tool in any other years. In districts that have some CEP schools and some non-CEP schools, then the CEP schools are excluded from the calculation, but you would typically have to do that for the non-CEP schools. And this is really looking forward because of the school year that we've had this past year and this next school year for seamless summer, there aren't any paid meals. So this is kind of irrelevant right now, but wanted to go ahead and include this as something that you would want to think about in subsequent years. If all schools in an SFA are operating a non-pricing provision, so CEP, you also are not required to develop a meal charge policy because nobody's charging for meals. But if you have any schools that are traditionally counting and claiming, then you would have to develop a meal charge policy. And by this point, most of our school systems have a meal charge policy in place, and we probably reviewed that the last time that you had administrative review. So you just want to make sure that you still have that document if you are typically not a traditional counting and claiming system. So record keeping requirements. So you must retain records used in the development of the ISP during the entire period that CEP is in effect. And the records for that initial approval year and all records from that year and any updates that you may have made to your identified students. So it's very, very important that when you elect CEP, that you have all of the backup to support those numbers. And that is not necessarily just a printout from your software system. You're going to need to have all of the backup. That is going to mean every piece of paper that identifies a child as homeless or migrant or foster. That is going to include the the My Student list from EScholar that identifies who's free through direct certification. You need to have all of that backup to support them. And you can keep this backup electronically, so you can keep it in in the software system itself, or in a electronic file, or you can have it printed out in a drawer. You just have to be able to produce that when it's asked for. So oftentimes we find that when it is printed, where you can lock it up in a safe place and keep it backed up electronically, most systems are usually good at being able to produce that from one of those two sources. You have to maintain that documentation for 3 years after the submission of the final claim for reimbursement using that claiming percentage. So what that means is typically we have to keep information for 3 years plus the current year. Well, if you're using data for CEP for 4 years, that 3 years plus the current year, that 3 years is going to extend basically back to almost 7 when we look at it this way. So we've got the 4 years of our CEP cluster, and then you'd have to keep it for 3 years past that to meet that requirement by federal regulation. So almost forever is how I like to think about it. So we do know that we've already discussed this, so our notification requirements. So the state agency and LEAs are responsible for completing that CEP population data and the worksheet on our website. And this filling out of this form is what serves as the notification system for both the school system and the state. So the notification includes the eligible districts, the nearly eligible districts, the currently participating districts, districts that are eligible for a grace year, and then also in completion of that forms, we also notify you of your eligibility for district-wide. So when you are completing that form, you'll see that district-wide percentage is also determined on that worksheet before you even make a final election. And that's our way of notifying you of your eligibility at the district level. And then you're responsible for telling us the eligibility on the school level. So that's putting in the information about the identified students and the enrollment is your notification to us of whether or not that school is eligible to participate in CEP. So this is just a repeat of the slide that we've talked about earlier. So these are the deadlines that are in effect for this year. And so we're approaching that initial deadline of submission of June 30th. So the population data form and the CEP worksheet are now open on the website. They've been open for about a month. So we opened it around May 1st. And you can see memo SFS 21-X157 for instructions on completing that worksheet. And it has some step-by-step pictures on how to work through the worksheet and the population data form. And even though SFAs may be planning to operate the seamless summer option next school year, you are still responsible for completing the CEP population form and the CEP worksheet. So the worksheet is available under the green School Food Service tab. And from there, you click on CEP participation. At this point, we've been under that purple summer tab for the entire school year. So you may have forgotten where we normally keep the CEP worksheet, but it is under the green School Food Service tab. So you'll need to make sure that you're under that green tab to be able to find the CEP participation worksheet. And from there, you'll click on CEP participation. It'll then bring you to a screen that looks like this. And so initially, you'll see that this is your information that you submitted last year. So this is what was submitted last school year. And so it's program year 2021, and it's going to have your population data at the bottom and your CEP participation in the middle. And from there, if you click on the CEP elections 2022 in the middle box at the top, that'll take you to your information for this school year. So from there, you'll have a few more tabs that will appear. And so you will want to select the population Data tab. And from there, you'll enter your identified students and your total enrollment, and you'll do that by site. And we do also recommend that you utilize that calculator tool, the FAR button, to help you with clustering sites together for the best possible identified student percentage. So the identified students are reported in 4 different categories. So it's the direct certification students and their siblings, students identified as homeless, runaway, or migrant, Head Start or pre-K even start, and foster students. And all numbers, your identified students and your total enrollment, are included in this worksheet. So this is to be submitted by June 30th through the website. And so from here, you simply by site will enter your directly certified students, your homeless, migrant, runaway, Head Start, even start, foster care. It'll then automatically tally that up in the total identified students and the enrollment. You'll have to enter that as well. And once that is correct, you'll certify and submit. And because this information is intended to be for the current school year, all the fields do pre-populate to 0. So we don't have the information rolling over from the prior year because we want to ensure that you're entering the current year's information. And do make sure that you do submit data here. Occasionally we'll see that these submissions do come through with 0 submitted here. That is not something you would want to do. You want to make sure that you are running those DC matches and that you have a fairly accurate identified student and enrollment to enter here. So once you enter all the information at the site level, you'll then certify and submit. So you'll have the information for each site. So here we have site A, B, C, and D, and we've included all of the students that are identified as directly certified, homeless, migrant, runaway, Head Start, Even Start, and foster kids. After that, you want to make sure that you certify the information is correct and that this information will be used in the CEP worksheet. And then you'll want to submit. So sometimes the question comes, where do we get that direct certification number? So these students that should reflect your SNAP matches from your direct match run. And this is going to be typically any date, but no later than after that May SNAP run. So the May SNAP run should be coming in the next week or so, and that would be the last run that could be used for this school year. So if you remember correctly, the information that is usually received early July is the first run for the next school year. So the last run that you are able to use for this school year is the May SNAP run that should be available about next week. So you can access this information through the My Students tab on eScholar, and you can then take that SNAP match and any DC extended students that you may have extended those benefits from the SNAP children to their siblings, and you would put that in the DC count on the worksheet. So the My Students report allows users to get a total count of their matched students. It can be filtered by your LEA or by site code, and you can simply go through here, select your school or site, your match type, which is typically SNAP, the status, you do your match as the status, and then the school year is 2021. And then from there, you can filter the results and it would give you the list of your matched students. If you have not been utilizing the My Students report, it's extremely helpful. And you can, like I said, go down and change and just select one site at a time, or you can do your entire system. So if you do make any changes to your population data form, you have to resubmit the CEP worksheet. So they work in conjunction with each other. So once you submit the population data, that information populates over to the CEP worksheet. And then if you submit the CEP worksheet. If you go back and make changes to the population data form, you're going to have to resubmit that worksheet. So step 2 is the CEP worksheet. Once the population data is correct and submitted, you are ready to submit the worksheet. All of the data entered into your population data form would then populate to the CEP worksheet. You must submit the initial worksheet by that June 30th deadline. So the day you submit the population data, you should at least give a general CEP election by that date. This is not the final date that you can make elections. So this year that date is September 30th. So the worksheet, so from your population data, you'll then go to the worksheet, and here it'll pull all of the information that you just submitted from your population data. And if you pay attention, this first group right here, it includes the information that you are already using for CEP. So whether it be from the prior year or whether it be from a base year of 2018, it's going to be included here. And then this next section would be your current year CEP information. The information you just submitted on the CEP worksheet, on the population data. Then in this last column, you'll then want to select whether or not you're going to participate in a cluster. If you want to participate district-wide, you'll make those decisions here. So the base year is always the first year of the 4-year cycle, and this gets really confusing. So when we're submitting data right now in June of 2021, that data, the first time we would technically be using that data would be school year 21-22. And so that would mean that a base year of 2022 would be 21-22 school year is the first year of the cycle. So that is the data that you're entering right now. It gets super confusing, but that's what it's intended to mean by base year. Once you enter that information in the top part of the worksheet, you want to pay close attention to the bottom part. And here you want to make sure you select what you intend to select for either continuing the base year or renewing your base year. If you have the same cluster that you had in prior year, you'll have the option to either continue with the original numbers or to reestablish using those new numbers. So you'll want to make that decision. If you select a cluster that doesn't match what you did in prior years, your only option is going to be to renew the current base year. So you cannot continue if you've made changes to that cluster. So if you're not including a school that you did include previously, or you're adding some additional schools into the cluster, then your only option would be to renew the current base year. So do pay really close attention to that. Oftentimes we'll see that a school system renews the current year, but it's a lower percentage than what they had previously had, and that they really intended just to extend for another year. So please really pay close attention to that, that selection on the bottom of the screen. So I mentioned this just a little while ago. So you want to, if you're wanting to operate district-wide, so the entire system to be in the same cluster, you can click that district-wide button at the top, and it'll put all of your sites into cluster 1 and cluster them together. This is super easy when you've got a lot of sites. I often like to do this as well when I'm putting the majority of schools in one cluster and I have just a few that I'm not. I'll select the district-wide button, let them all be put into cluster one, and then go back and manually change those ones that I don't intend to be in that cluster and make them either not participating or move them into a different cluster. So the initial CEP elections are due by June 30th. And so that is the population data and the CEP worksheet. And the final submission must be done by September 30th, 2021. So once you have all of your information into the worksheet and you've pressed either continue or renew, you then can certify that the information is correct and submit. If you have questions about eScholar Direct Match, you can contact Jane in our data team, with our data team. If you have questions about logging into eScholar, you may also speak with your LEA security coordinator, and they can give access as well as change or reset passwords. So this next slide, I'm just going to briefly talk about the updates that are coming to eScholar. So this is super, super exciting. This has been a project that has been in the works for a few years, and we have been slowly trying to develop this and really get something that is ready to go. And we think we're about there. So we have been working closely with eScholar on a project that will improve the matching system. And our system is intended to go live for school year 21-22. So that's next school year. It's the one that's right around the corner. So this system will allow schools to match student enrollment against program records to determine eligibility. So your question is probably, well, aren't we already doing that? And the answer is yes, but we're going to really expand on that in this next update. So the updated system is not only going to match students from SNAP, but it's also going to match students for temporary assistance for needy families, or TANF, foster care, migrant. It'll also have the ability to do DC extended based on address matching, and also a feature to allow manual matching of students. So our goal with this is to really get a system that is the single source of truth for identifying students. So it is going to pull data from Merrill, which is the state's migrant homeless database. It's going to pull information from the matching for TANF. It's going to pull in information from foster kids from DCFS lists. And so it's going to be a single source of truth. So you won't have to go track down the backup documentation to support this, because it will already be in the system and it will be gathered from another reliable source in the state database. So this is awesome. This is really, really great. It's also going to do a wonderful thing by taking your kids that are identified as already matched, and it's going to look at those addresses and find other kids that may be in your system that live at that same address, and will help you extend to those siblings that may be living in the same household. So this is just, it's been a big project, but it's definitely going to, we're testing it right now, and really going to hopefully be ready to roll shortly after the start of the school year. The updated system is also going to be the home of our new CEP worksheet. So after this year, your submission through the child nutrition website, our next submission, we hope to be in the eScholar system. And the reason why is because our single source of truth will be in that system. So we'll be able to pull the data straight from these resources and enter them into the worksheet automatically. And therefore, all of your backup will be housed and stored in one location. So this is a really great thing. I know with all new things, there's always something very scary about, making changes. And I'm sure there will be some kinks through this process, but I really feel that as we're moving into everybody operating seamless summer, this is a great year for us to introduce this new system and really work to improve it, as we are not processing nearly the number of applications. We may not be due verification. And so hopefully this will be a great time to introduce this new system. So that is the end of today's presentation. There are a few questions. I'm going to look through all of those. If you have any additional questions, please post them in the chat box and I'll do my best to answer those. The first question is about if a school is no longer operating within the school system and was part of a CEP cluster. Are you eligible for a grace year, or would you have to re-establish CEP? So you would have to reestablish if the cluster doesn't match what it did in the prior election. You would have to reestablish. We are going to post this PowerPoint. It should be posted probably tomorrow. So it is also recorded. So we will have the PowerPoint and the recording posted to Louisiana Fit Kids. So underneath the training slides, under training on the website. And then from there, you can go to today's presentation and you'll be able to access that. And that is not available yet, but it should be available in the next couple of days. And then in addition, we also will post the slides on our website, the child nutrition website, and that hopefully will be done tomorrow as well. And the CEP memo that has, it does have the initial deadline as June 15th. June 30th is technically the deadline. I assure you that we will not be angry if you submit them early by June 15th, and we will start reaching out to SFAs around that June 15th mark, but by the federal standard, the deadline is June 30th. Yeah, if there's a school that is not going to participate in the child nutrition program and was part of a cluster, you would need to reestablish. You cannot just continue on. So the question, we also have a question about the new eScholar system. Will this data be available in a single report like the My Students list, where it's pulling all of the SNAP students? So the plan is that it will be able to be pulled by the separate program. So you'll be able to easily identify who's in what program. We are trying to work through some of the kinks there to make sure that we don't have kids that are double counted who may be in two separate programs. So we're still trying to kind of iron out some of those final details, but the goal is to make it as easy as possible for you to pull that information in a summary type form like you are right now. Any other questions? Please feel free to ask any questions. I'll do my best to answer them. If you have any particular questions about your typical your own scenarios about CEP and whether or not you should consider a grace year or electing CEP if you're a lower percentage, like somewhere in the 40, 45, 50%, feel free to give me a call. You can call the main number and they can transfer you to me. You can also email the direct email address and they can and she can forward that to me as well, or you can reach out to me directly. So however you want to go about that, feel free to do so. I thank you all for listening. So this has been kind of a crazy year, and so it's hard to understand why we still have to do these CEP submissions when we know that we're all going to be free next year. But I strongly encourage you to make CEP decisions that are beneficial to you as the school system, even though you may not be utilizing those percentages next year. So do really make sure that the data is still good and valid, and that you're making decisions that are supportive of the system as a whole, even though most of the meals will be free under the seamless summer option for next year. So I thank you again for your time, and feel free to reach out with any questions, and have a good rest of your week. And our next training is not till toward the end of the month. So we'll look for you then.